I've been enjoying this series so far. So it's been an action-packed series thus far, and tonight is no different. Tonight we're going to be talking about sex and mental health. It's a very pivotal topic. It's a topic that is ravaging society. We're saturated with it. And we want to understand what sex has to do with mental health and what mental health has to do with sex. Now, just to recap, we've gone through a bit of a journey, haven't we? The first night, we talked about understanding your mind. We went into a deep dive into this, fascinating machine called the brain. And this brain, we realized that is responsible for how we feel. All the emotions we feel, we realize has an underpinning biochemical component to it. It is fundamental. Our feelings, our mental health is not based on some wishy-washy thing. It's not because that we can't control our emotions or some have better personalities than others. We realize that actually our mental health, and in particular our emotions and our mind, all have very fundamental, critical biochemical components to it. Now, we also realize that there's even structural components that as we progress through the pathways that lead to deranged mental health, like reduced serotonin, reduced dopamine, we learned that those things have architectural changes to the brain. We see reduced frontal lobe activity, and we're going to see this again in this talk that we're going to have tonight. And then after that, we had a deep dive into the digital brain. The digital brain. Oh, sorry. Looks like we're in a different topic there. Yeah, so we had a deep dive into the digital brain, and that was a fascinating topic, wasn't it? Like, we looked at what technology has to do with our mental health. We saw that, in the early days, we had television. We saw that television is essentially a hypnotic tool that can put our brain from a beta wave state into an alpha wave state, and how that it diminishes our ability to make good calculated decisions. And then we also talked about, and this is very crucial for tonight's topic, we also talked about how the smartphone is considered a supernormal stimulus. What did I say, everyone? A supernormal stimulus. And a supernormal stimulus is an entity that interacts with our brain. It oversaturates our brain more than what our brain is capable or what it's designed to handle. So the phone, because it does so many things, you can text, you can make phone calls, you can look at your emails, you can use it for GPS, and there's social media apps, and there's scrolling. That all of these things saturate and overwhelm the system in the brain. And this is realizing that supernormal stimulus fries our dopamine reward system, and we're going to see that same mechanism tonight. And then tomorrow night, my colleague at the back here is going to talk about building healthy habits. We're going to be learning some interesting things along the way, some really key practical things, but it can be very overwhelming. How do we apply those things realistically in our lives? What are the key habits for successful people? And what is the neuropsychological underpinnings of those habits? How do we achieve having long-lasting habit change? Isn't that what we want? And then the two R's. The two R's. I don't know what's going on here. That's important, by the way, but that's already happened. Just trying to see why it's switching different presentations, but the AV team are fantastic. They'll sort it out. Yeah, we don't want to be that person, right? We want to be successful, we want to thrive. Okay, trying to get onto the right presentation. There we go. So the night after that, we're going to look at the two R's. very crucial ours, isn't it? Relationship and resilience. In order for relationships to thrive, you need resilience. In order for resilience to take shape, it's good to have a community around you, to have relationships. So we're going to go into dive into that. And then finally, let's see where this is going to. I might need some help at the back just to switch those. That's okay. Having some technical issues, that's all right. But yeah, so when it comes to sex and mental health, it's a big plague in our society, isn't it? You know, it does, no matter where you go to the shopping mall, we're bombarded with adverts and billboards, and somehow with all those saturation, it has to have an effect on the mind. You know, and you know, there's a saying that says sex sells, right? So that means even the business world, even society at large, they know that sex is so primal to the brain that they try to exploit it to sell products. But we don't want to be trapped within the, you know, that frame of thinking. We want to get out of that cycle and get out of that dopamine dysregulation. And then the final night, and you don't want to miss this, the final night is entitled, the second last night I should say is avoiding cognitive decline. This is one of my favorite topics. Australia, we're in an aging population, and as a result, we need to pay attention to how we can avoid this. How can we avoid cognitive decline? Is dementia and Parkinson's, which is a disease of the brain, can that be prevented? Can it even be reversed? And also, there's an intimate relationship between mental health and cognitive decline. We find out that actually, if you have depression and anxiety in your 20s and 30s, you're 3 times likely to have dementia and Alzheimer's later in life. And that is a shocking thought. And then purpose, growth, and mental health. This final night is about thriving. It's about flourishing. I want us to not just be overcoming, you know, the common ills of mental health that plague society, depression, anxiety, you know, bipolar, schizophrenia. Yes, we want to have solutions to these problems, but how do we go from just getting by to actually flourishing? Is that what you guys want? We want to be flourishing. We want to be, you know, have purpose and growth and know that we can conquer anything that comes on our paths. So we want to know how to build resilience and how to grow a mind that thrives. So just as a brief introduction for those who are new here, my name is Dr. Ore Enoma, and I work at Townsville University Hospital as a neurosurgery doctor, and I have a very strong passion for the brain. And I've also had experience in general practice where I've treated men for some of the sexual dysfunction that we're going to be talking about today. You know, I've seen lifestyle changes that actually work. So I've seen it work in practice. So it gives me a good pleasure to share that. But before I go into a deep dive into it, I'd like to just say a warm thank you to the church that's hosting this presentation, Aitkenvale Church. Very grateful for allowing us to use this space. And it's a customary here that we have a word of prayer before we start. So please bow your heads as we pray. Heavenly Father, great God of the universe, thank you, Lord, for just providing for our needs, for understanding, Lord, that we need a social life. We need to communicate, and we need to have a good relationship with each other. And Father, one of those important relationships is a marriage relationship, and that you want us to have a good sex life, but also you know that how some of those behaviors, when it is not applied correctly, can also lead to dysregulated mental health issues. So, Lord, help us, Lord, to understand this. We ask this in the name of your Son, Christ Jesus. Amen. Sex and mental health, love, lust, the brain, what is really going on? So now, just to set the theme, there are some certain core things that if you understand, you will get to the nuts and bolts of what is actually happening when it comes to sex, right? So the core things is that I want you guys to remember these themes highlighted in bold. One of them is PEA. We're going to understand what is PEA. We're going to also understand the 4 stages of marriage. We're going to also understand this interesting concept called the Coolidge effect. What is the Coolidge effect, and how can we avoid it? Then, when the Coolidge effect takes place and is exacerbated by the supernormal stimuli that we talked about when it comes to devices, but this time when it comes to dysregulated sexual behavior, we actually find that there are 3 adverse brain changes that occur when it comes to dysregulated sexual behavior. And you can actually see it on MRI studies and functional MRI studies. And then we're going to look at the negative effects of pornography and masturbation, because the fact is society, what does society say when it comes to pornography and masturbation? If you went online and you want to get like this standard psychologist opinion out there when it comes to pornography and masturbation, let's be honest, what do people say? What do those so-called experts or the traditional opinion say about pornography and masturbation? What do they tend to say? You guys can be open. They say, it's normal. That's what some of them say. Anything else? Improves your sex life? Anything else? It's healthy. They even say that it's healthy, which is mind-boggling, because when you actually go into the biochemistry of it, you actually see how deleterious those sexual behaviors are in reality. So it makes you wonder, why do they propagate those narratives? I have my personal opinion. I think it's just a simple fact that everyone's human, and people tend to propagate what they do themselves or what they believe in. There's bias, even in the literature, that we have to account for bias. That's why, as I'm working on a PhD study on nutrition and brain cancer, and I have to make sure that, that there's going to be a panel of researchers that are going to look at whether there were any biases involved in my study. That's part of the academic literature. But unfortunately, some of those things sift through because of industry and who they're sponsored. So there's a big network of web of issues that surround why some of those things are popular. But we're going to get down to the bare bones and what the truth really lies. So we're going to find out dopamine has something to do with it, oxytocin has something to do with it, and prolactin has something to do with it. So that's just to whet your appetite. That's just to whet your appetite. So, we're going to go through a bit of a roadmap. We'll go through a bit of some steps here. We're going to look at the different stages of relationships. And by the end of that, we're going to find concrete solutions to dealing with dysregulated sexual behavior. Next slide. So, why does it matter? Why do we need to talk about this? Well, like I said, it has a major mental health impact, whether we realize it or not. It's a major player in depression, anxiety, emotional discord, and compulsive patterns that change personality and motivation. I wonder if that resonates with anyone today. It has real-life relationship impact. There have been couples that are divorced over this issue, over this concept of sexual, dysregulation and behavior, because it's linked to infidelity, whether indirectly or directly. We're going to talk about this concept of novelty seeking, and also even if it doesn't lead to divorce, there's also the issues of marital dissatisfaction. Even if people are just getting by, they're just trying to make it work. But what if God had something better in mind when it comes to this? And then there's the public health impact. Now, I don't know if you guys noticed that Australia has essentially put a pornography ban, isn't it? Essentially, they've put restrictions at least. And it's a good first step. That there's a much more they can do. But yeah, it's good that that local governments are becoming more and more aware of how big an issue that even local secular governments are trying to put a clamp on this issue. So I just want to make sure that you guys understand that this is not merely a moral issue. This is not just a moral quandary, but there's fundamental neurochemical and biological behavioral models that underpin why both whether you're young or old, why we should be careful and how we engage in sexual behavior. So the first thing I want to introduce is this chemical called phenylethylamine. Have any of you guys heard of this chemical, phenylethylamine? It's known as the love chemical. It is true that there's this concept of chemistry. This person has good chemistry with that person. That's actually real life. That's real life. It turns out that there is indeed chemistry, a real chemical component, and that chemical is phenylethylamine. Your brain is saturated with this chemical. There's not particular part of the brain, because last time we talked about the frontal lobe, and then we also have the limbic system, which is the emotional component. But phenylethylamine is produced ubiquitously throughout the brain. So it's very, very essential And it's essentially the chemical. If you want to know how people fall in love or why people fall in love, you can blame this chemical. You can blame this chemical. Like that is the culprit. And it's the reason why when they meet a new partner and they fall in love, that they can see no wrong in that person. It's as if that person is an angel. And it doesn't matter whether the third party, can see, like obvious issues with this, relationship. They'll be like, they're just completely blind. They say love is blind, isn't it? You can blame phenylethylamine for that. I have a love-hate relationship with this chemical, so to speak. But this is really important because it just shows that love has to go more than chemistry. Yes, chemistry is important. God created that, isn't it? But love has to be principled in order for it to thrive. Chemistry alone tends to be unstable. Next slide. So there are some people, they have that need to be in love. Because yes, it's a nice feeling to be in love. Now, for those of you who have experienced it, it's a nice feeling. It's a wonderful feeling. It's an intoxicating feeling. It gives you that rush, that butterflies. Who doesn't want to experience that? But unfortunately, like every other neurotransmitter that we talked about, every other chemical that we talked about, including serotonin and dopamine, when it's produced, they all have potentially, especially dopamine, play a role in addictive cycles. And there are some people, they have that intoxicating feeling of PEA. That is an addictive feeling, so much that they are addicted to that feeling of that new love experience. I don't know if any of you guys have experienced that or met people like that, where it's like, they might break up with someone, they move on to the next partner, to the next partner, to the next partner, because they want to keep that feeling of that first love experience going. It's a very real thing. You see that in high schoolers, you see that in university students, where, you want a minute, you say like, wait, weren't you with this person yesterday? That's literally because of that PEA. You have to sympathize with them because that is the chemistry that is going on in there. So what happened is that people often misread this. So I want to just highlight this, is that often this chemical is not designed to last. Well, there's an average window, I should say, where this lasts, right? So the average time where PEA persists, as it says here, is 18 months for the average person. Most of the time, it persists for about 4 years. So that new love, or what we call honeymoon phase, is usually responsible or secondary to PEA, and it on an average person is 18 months, but for the most part, it's about 4 years. And that's the honeymoon phase, which is about right. If you talk to most couples, they will say that, yeah, that's when that honeymoon phase kind of ranges. But is that always what it's meant to be designed? Is that the original design, or is that time frame what it was meant to be? Next slide. So this is like a crucial concept. This is what studies have shown. Studies have shown that people that are happily married are always happily single first. That is what studies have shown. Okay? And a large study showed that happiness 1 year after marriage returns to roughly the same baseline as before the romantic relationship. Do you know that? So in other words, whatever state of happiness that you were before that marriage, relationship, often, yes, because of PEA, it'll rise, and then of course, the average is, 18 months. But they said that even after 1 year, that state of happiness goes to that same baseline level. So that's why it's important that happy singles make happy married couples. So the implication is that marriage does not cure emotional instability, or it does not necessarily confer happiness itself. So people think that as soon as I get married, I'm going to be the happiest person in the world. It doesn't mean that, actually. It's actually they're unrelated. Therefore, emotional stability and health should be developed before serious romantic commitment. I think there'll be no disagreement there. Now, there are 4 stages of marriage, and there's a lot of couples here that I'm sure they will be able to relate and be able to highlight these. The first stage, you know what the first stage is? It's written here. It says the euphoria stage. That's when PEA is at its peak. That's where, You've got those rose-colored eyes, the rose-colored glasses. Everything they do is amazing. Even the most lamest jokes are the funniest jokes ever. That is the peak of a relationship. That's when intimacy is at its best. There's that, there's just so much passion and excitement and bubbliness and warm fuzzies. But it doesn't last that long because eventually, like I said, PEA starts to drop. So therefore, what happens? There's what we call the non-euphoria stage. This is when things aren't not that bad, but that's when little things start to irritate you. All of a sudden you start to notice. A few things. Testing. Oh, amazing. Thank you for the AV team. So this is where all those little irritations start to come through. So all of a sudden you notice that, they leave the toilet seat up when before you didn't notice that. All of a sudden, they notice that they forget to get certain things that you had all these expectations for. So all those little irritations start to come through. But the marriage is still going on. And then the next stage is this is a sad one. It's called the despicable stage. This is where you look across the room and you're like, how did I get myself in this? What went wrong? What was I thinking? And all of a sudden, it's not just feelings of resentment, but the studies have shown that actually people actually start to hate that person. Feelings of hatred come up. And that's what the studies have shown. And then, of course, that despicable stage, that's where the divorce rates tend to happen. That's when the divorce rates become very high. They say about 95% of couples move through these patterns if the marriage lasts long enough. So that's 95% of couples. That's the sequence of events that occurs, the natural sequence. Isn't that sad? But if you go through the psychological literature, if you go through especially when it comes to marriage counseling, I don't know if some of you guys are marriage counselors here. I can vouch for this. If you go through the typical marriage counseling textbooks, they will say that, yes, you go through these stages, which is, they say 95% of it, that's expected. But if you're doing a really good job as a marriage counselor, if you're going to get paid the big bucks as a marriage counselor, if you get them from the despicable stage to the toleration stage. Isn't that sad? So that's where that's considered a success, which is where at that stage, they see all these negative aspects of their partner, but then they just learn to tolerate it. They just learn to say, you know what, it is what it is. I've been dealt what I've been dealt with. Let's just make it happen. After all, they say, divorce isn't really worth it. There's side effects of divorce, right? It's cost too much. So they weigh the cost and benefits, and they say, you know what, let's just make it work. Let's make it work for the kids. Let's make it work for whatever, So that's what we call the toleration stage. Only 1% of people stay in the euphoria stage. Only 1%. But do you know, I'm just going to switch the slides over. Do you know that actually, I would testify based on scripture that God intended that we would always stay in the euphoria stage. Do we agree with that? That we always stay in the euphoria stage. All this, that is a lot of baloney. We don't want to be in that category. That's 95% of people. And you know what? It doesn't matter if you're from a Christian background, a non-Christian background. There's still 60% of people end up in divorce. So what is it? What is the ingredient? What is the biochemistry underpinning of why we enter through those stages? Do you think it has something to do with our sex lives? Do you think it has something to do with sexual behavior? It's going to be very fascinating to highlight what the driving factors that underpins all of this. So we're just going to go through these slides here because we talked about all of these. Keep going through that. And we're going to talk about the biochemical underpinnings. And one of the things is this concept of of dopamine. Concept of dopamine. So just making sure I'm on the right track. Yeah, fantastic. So dopamine, we briefly introduced it in our first lecture. Does anyone remember what is dopamine? What is the primary role for dopamine? The feel-good chemical, right? But it's more than just the feel-good. It's actually the chemical that deals with desire. It deals with interest. The reason why you're interested to get up in the morning and conquer the world, and some people are just, you met some people that's just so motivated. It's like, man, like I'm just waking up out of bed, and it's almost like overwhelming to see people that are just like, yeah, let's do this, let's go. They've got a lot of dopamine. They've got a natural, it's that cause for drive, right? But dopamine is crucial because it's designed for us to maintain interest. And there are 5 things that lead to high doses of dopamine that floods our brain. All of these things, I'm sure, will be not unfamiliar to you. Is food, sex, love, friendship, and novelty. And that goes in order of intense dopamine release. Dopamine, type of dopamine release. So novelty is interesting because all of these things they're produced in the limbic system, so to speak. And the thing is that when God created these pathways, there was a specific reason for that. You see, when it comes to novelty, it was intended that novelty should be be released when it comes to learning new things. So whenever we learn something new, we should have that feel-good feeling. That's what it was the original purpose of dopamine, is when it comes to learning new things. Novelty, in and of itself, should not be necessarily found in these other categories. Yes, it's good to have some variation of variety, etc., but that's not its primary role. The primary role was to, whenever we learn something new, novelty in of itself as a separate category would release dopamine. So that's very, very interesting in terms of the role that novelty plays and how the relationship between that and novelty and dopamine, sorry. Yes, next slide. So, like I said before, dopamine does not necessarily equate pleasure. Yes, it is the feel-good hormone, but it's more the interest. It's more the drive to get pleasure. Actually, pleasure is actually to do with the opioid system. The opioids. So I don't know if you guys may be familiar with endone, and they work on that pathway, the opioid pathway. So dopamine is called the anticipator. It drives wanting, desire, seeking behavior rather than the felt pleasure itself. The opioid system is linked to pleasure, yet the dopamine system is described as stronger because it keeps the person pursuing the stimulus. That's why dopamine is so crucial, because even if the thing is pleasurable, what is actually, it's the desire for that pleasure itself that is a kicker in that system. So essentially, the way it is described is that we seek more than we are satisfied. So that tends to be, if the dopamine system is dysregulated, that can become more and more exacerbated, where the actually wanting becomes more than the satisfaction that you get from that particular stimulus. So when you get a large dopamine squirt, so to speak, it intensifies pursuit, but sexual stimulation and orgasm in particular are presented as the largest natural surges available to the reward circuitry. So because it's the largest producer of dopamine, we need to pay attention to how, when it's done in an improper way, how that can affect the brain. Next slide. So this is where the concept of supernormal stimuli comes into. So supernormal stimuli overrides satiety mechanisms, and it also weakens the I am done signal. So what happens is that when you get a stimulus that is abnormally intense, abnormally not the way our brain is designed to consume, then it actually burns our dopamine pathways. It actually overrides that sense of satisfaction, because remember, there's satiety and there's wanting. So if that is so lopsided, then it actually can lead to a dangerous spiral. So what happens is that this can occur in very practical ways, either in excessive frequency or or within natural sex itself, or through the intensity of the act, plus or minus the media that is consumed to reproduce that intensity. Because see, what happened is that we have a normal baseline where if you engage in a particular thing, whether it's food, novelty or sex, you have the gradual rise, and then you should expect a natural fall, but it should never fall below your baseline. Whereas what happens when you get a supernormal stimulus, you get a sudden spike, but you also get a sudden drop, precipitous drop. And then all of a sudden your baseline goes to a new low. So you get this, declining, oscillating effect. Next slide. So there are three adverse brain changes that occur when it comes to dopamine dysregulation and supernormal stimulus as a cause for that. So three things to remember is desensitization, sensitization, and hypofrontality. So what happens in desensitization is that you have a decrease in the dopamine receptors. Because if you remember that neurotransmitter synaptic cleft diagram that I showed, if you have a neuron and another neuron, when they communicate with each other, and you get this flood of dopamine, and you have these corresponding receptors, all of a sudden, because it's super saturated with dopamine, the brain goes, hey, I don't need that many receptors anymore. I'm just gonna, down-regulate the amount of receptors that is needed to that accepting neuron. So all of a sudden you get, because of the downregulation of receptors, those neurons are not as active, and then you get what we call, you get less pleasure, and you need always a stronger stimulus to get the same output. And then after that, you get this sensitization that occurs. And then what happens is that over time, you get hypofrontality. What that means is that your frontal lobe, which is what was described last night, is if you cover your forehead, your hand on your forehead, that actually begins to recede. That actually you see actually cortical thinning in your brain over time, because those receptors aren't needed anymore. And so the brain goes, hey, there's plenty of dopamine. Why do I need to be here? So it begins to slow down. It begins to not be as expressed, and then you get reverse plasticity, so to speak, where you get hyper or low frontal lobe volume. Isn't that scary? Isn't that scary? So we've talked about that. We talked about those receptors that decline. We went into that already. But I want to actually go into that in marital terms. Just go back before. In marital terms, when a partner who was once fully satisfied may no longer seem enough to be numbed to the numbed reward system. So if they have a reward system that is numbed, then that means that they're no longer satisfied as they were before. Isn't that sad? That's what happens when you get a dysregulated dopamine system. And we call that, there's actually a pathway called the pornography pathway. When they engage when there's one or both partners engaged in pornography, it goes into that desensitization, sensitization, hyperfrontality. That's the traditional trajectory of the porn pathway, and that's a very scary pathway to be in, and it leads to this vicious cycle of addictive behavior. Next slide. So we'll talk about sensitization. Just to go into a bit more detail, it's often what happens. You get this super memory of that stimulus, that intense stimulus, and then of pleasure. And what I have is stored in the emotional component of your brain called your amygdala, which also is important with memory associated with your limbic system. And what happens is that it rewires your nerve connections, and it makes addictive-like cues or thoughts and buzzwords exaggerated the concept. So what happens is that even when people are in that addictive behavior, even simple benign cues, like for example, they may see they're so sensitized that they look at anything to be sexual. Have you guys maybe seen someone like that, or that they're very grotesque with their jokes, because they've already gone into that pathway, that addictive behavior. So now everything is hypersexualized than they normally would have seen. So at this stage, people also become more irritable. They become more sensitive to ordinary frustrations and more anxiety prone. Isn't that scary? Isn't that scary? So when they get into that pathway, when people are in that addictive pathway, it's no wonder they actually become naturally irritable. They become more frustrated. Things that would normally not bother them, that they'll be like water off a duck's back, because of that addictive behavior from pornography, it actually makes them more irritable and more unwilling to deal with the common nuisances of life, which is very, very scary. And then, like I said, hyperfrontality. That's when, so normally, like I said last night, the frontal lobe should be the seat, is a regulator of the limbic system. It should always override the limbic system. But what happens with this, this downward spiral is like you get the opposite. It's the limbic system now overrides the frontality. That's why it's no wonder that people become more irritable, more emotional, and more frustrated through simple, stressful situations. So this is the point where self-control, long-range judgment, and stable affect start to deteriorate together. Next slide. Okay, so now what is the recommended time frame between, when sex should occur, right? So we notice that those addictive behaviors can occur, that negative pathway can occur through one of two things. We talked about frequency, we talked about the type of stimulus, that is abnormal stimulus. So what happens is that studies have shown that normally within 96 hours, 4 days, is when you get the natural resolution of dopamine. You get the natural rebound effect of dopamine from after a sexual act. Right, so what that normally should happen is that the studies have shown that on average it's about 4 days where the dopamine should revert, and also they will recommend that even if you want to get the full return of dopamine, they recommend even 7 days to get that full rebound effect of dopamine. So that's the key to ensuring that you have always healthy natural levels of dopamine is to reduce the frequency of sex, so to speak. So what that means is that prolonged sexual inhibition protects the brain circuits involved from overstimulation. That's the key. That's the key. Now, there's also an endocrine component as well. So I talked about dopamine, but also testosterone. So they say often after sex, you get a drop in testosterone, which is natural, and then you'll get a reliable spike around day 7. So this, there's a lot in society, there's a lot of talk about testosterone, how there's a chronic decline in testosterone among men. But what they say is that if they actually abstain from sexual activity for about 7 days, or we even recommend 14 days, then they'll actually get a healthy rebound effect of testosterone around day 7. Which is actually good news that that chronic low testosterone can actually be reverted. So we should essentially the theme is that we should be careful of avoiding frequent sexual stimulation in order to preserve our dopamine and testosterone pathway. Next slide. So one of the things that we talked about is that it warns against is that yes, we need to be, there's a balance, isn't it? There's a balance. Yes, we need to have long periods enough for abstention, but we shouldn't be, we should be careful not to abstain for too long because we don't want to reduce bonding, isn't it? Because bonding is important and prolactin is crucial. Oxytocin is crucial for that. And prolactin is crucial for satiety. And what happens is that when people engage in abnormal stimulus like masturbation, that feeling of satiety is not as intense. So therefore, the temptation to overdo it is there because that normal satiety that is experienced in sexual interaction, studies have shown, is that it doesn't achieve that same satiety level. So that's why the addictive behavior is contributed to that as well. So, and like I said, dopamine is key for seeking. So a healthy satiety model is sexual behavior within a committed relationship. And by so doing, when it's done in a not too frequent amount of manner, it ensures bonding, but it ensures a healthy dopamine, but you do it frequent enough to ensure that there's natural bonding that occurs. And when you get that balance right, then your body naturally has that satiety mechanism involved. So over time, it should, when we allow those healthy balances to occur, it should naturally restore the balance of all these neurochemicals that we talked about. Next slide. So why is masturbation in particular especially destabilizing? Masturbation is said to deliver a weaker satiety message, like I mentioned, than sex in and of itself. What happens is that as sensitivity falls, the person may need more extreme methods like toys or, in some extreme examples, partner swapping, et cetera, et cetera. You hear of all these crazy, crazy stories like that. That's because their dopamine reward system is completely fried. Okay, so what happens is that masturbation, which leads to the porn pathway, completely destroys that pathway, and it leads to more and more techniques that try and regain that dopamine spike that it wasn't designed to have. Next slide. But here's the solution. If you want to know the solution to all of this, here's the solution. So we recommend, studies recommend a 90-day reboot. We talked about a 8-week reboot when it comes to devices. A 90-day reboot is shown to regain, because we know that the brain is plastic. So we know that it can be plastic in a negative direction and also in a positive direction. So this is fantastic news, because what that means is that if we engage in this program, then we can actually recalibrate our dopamine system. Isn't that exciting? Isn't that exciting? It's also relieving as well. So they recommend for 90-day period, complete abstention from pornography, no masturbation, no orgasm activity, and of course, if married, there should be a defined reset period that's agreed upon both parties. And the goal of that is to allow the brain and the hormonal system to stabilize. To allow the brain and the hormonal system to stabilize. So 90 days is the key. And it's going to be challenging. It's going to be challenging, but it's going to be worth it in order to get those brain changes. That hyperfrontality that I was talking about, those studies have shown that cortex begins to regrow. It begins to come back to the way it was before, which is very, very exciting. Next slide. So there's some gains that have been noted from this reboot. Many people have said that they've gained a new perspective on life, which changed. That kind of loss of interest that people noticed as a result of that porn pathway, but they become to feel more alive. They become that person that you think like, man, they're always so excited, they're always so willing to engage in life. They're more hopeful. They have more joy from simple things, even just from watching a sunset. When that dopamine system is at a normal level, even just watching a sunset now becomes pleasurable. Classical music becomes more pleasurable. All these things that we take for granted, even just basic social interaction, even a good conversation becomes more pleasurable. Whereas when people are in that addictive cycle, those things don't have that same pleasure response. Social functioning improves. They have less fear of judgment. They have stronger eye contact. They have better conversation. More authentic attraction occurs rather than the fantasy that occurs. And also cognition function improves. As you imagine, as I said, we want that frontal lobe to be in control of the limbic system. What happens is that if you have increased frontal lobe function, you're naturally going to have stronger concentration, better memory. You're also going to have better decision-making capacity and productivity. There's a lot of case studies have shown that when people stop that porn pathway, they have a dramatic reduction in depression, anxiety, and sense of numbness, that numbness feeling that they have, that occurs. So it's very, very dramatic changes. And even things like anger and non-productive habits like gaming reduce as well when they engage in that pathway. So there's one quote from a guy that says, "I got my life back, my confidence seems indestructible, my focus is incredible, I want connection now, not just gratification." Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? So that is the hope. Now, it's not just men. It's not just men. Studies have shown that female pornography use is also on the rise. And it's described as being at an all-time high in modern day society. And it's linked to also extramarital behavior, the same with men, addiction, as well as dysfunction. And it's the same pathway. It's both men and women. It does not discriminate. And it's becoming higher and higher among men. So this reboot also works just as well for women just as much as men. And yeah, and also this concept of sex addiction withdrawal, which is analogous to many of the hard drug withdrawal that people get. So it's a very challenging phase, but like I said, when people stick to it, it's actually very beneficial to their brains. Next slide. So why do ordinary pleasures return after reset? Well, after that reboot, that people notice that their brain is no longer numbed to the reward, to normal rewards, like I mentioned. Because as dopamine rises, it becomes more sensitive. Those receptors come back. Remember those receptors I talked about where they withdraw and then you become hyperfrontal? Those receptors come back and it becomes more sensitive to simple pleasures. Social contact becomes less threatening. Even things like social anxiety often can be attributed to dysregulated sex reward dysfunction, so to speak. And what happens is when people are going into that 90-day reboot, they are more engaging and the brain is no longer trapped in that hypersexual cue scanning, like I was mentioning before. Okay, next slide. Okay. Now, there's some text from two of my favorite books from the Song of Solomon and Proverbs, which highlight this really well, where it talks about do not stir up or awaken love and pleasure before its time. And also in Proverbs it says, rejoice in the wife of your youth and be captured with delight in her love. So I think those two things work in consort with each other, isn't it? Both of those two things. It shows that God wants us to have a balance, isn't it? He wants us to not awaken that desire before its time, but at the same time, he wants us to also rejoice in the wife of your youth, in that relationship experience. And all that can happen when we have a normal dopamine reward system. Okay. Now, I've talked about the myths already. We all talked about at the beginning. These are all very common, but I like to make this counterclaim. After restoring balance, women are portrayed as anticipating intimacy just as much as men. And there's this disparity that people think that men need sex more than women. Well, actually, what we find is that you find that it's actually the dopamine system is awry, and you find that both men and women desire sex just as much. And it's actually very, very fascinating when there's a healthy system. And next slide. So, what's your decision tonight? Is it your desire to say no sexual stimulation outside of marriage? Is it your desire to watch out for internet and other triggers, no masturbation, and to get rid of whatever cues, whatever triggers that lead you to that pathway, whether it's television, movies, magazines, provocative sports media imagery, whatever it is? It's a battle out there because, like I said, we're saturated with all of this. We're saturated with all this sexual imagery, but it can be done with intentionality. And with marriage, the advice is less is best, to maintain that euphoric phase, with self-control and fidelity, preserving delight. Okay, so and there's no downsides, there's no side effects to it, only upsides to this. Okay. So just as a summary, we talked about a lot of things tonight. We talked about the PEA paradigm, where often that's the honeymoon phase, where we want to make sure that we stay in that honeymoon phase, but that will naturally decline. We talked about the concept of novelty and the Coolidge effect, how often as people engage in sexual activity and more novelty, which was not designed for the sexual contest, it was more designed for learning new things. Where we talked about the different stages of desensitization, sensitization, and hyperfrontality, and how negative that is. And then we also find that the concept of pair bonding as well. So putting those two things in balance. We don't want to keep it too infrequent where you reduce pair bonding, but you also don't want to be doing it too frequently where you go into that negative pathway. So here's all the different solutions that I proposed. We've already mentioned that. Next slide. So if we want to, the closing concept is that the design is for restraint, which leads to stable reward circuitry, which will eventually lead to an enduring affection for life. As we do it God's way, He will bless us with a more abundant life. It's not about repression, but it's about restoration of bonding, delight, mood stability, and long-term marital affection through disciplined use of sexuality. Is that your design? Is that your desire tonight? All right. Any questions? Any questions? I know it was a lot there. It was a lot, but it's a relatively simple concept when we look at the dopamine pathway and how we don't want to over-fry that system. We want to preserve that system by not doing it too frequently and by not using supernormal stimulus like we talked about last night. What if anyone has any questions about that? Sorry, can you say that again? As in they used to have interest, but they're no longer, or they just never had interest to begin with? I would say, like I said, I would recommend that 90-day fast. It depends on what situation, of course. I'm assuming this is a married situation. Of course, it has to be an agreement with the partner where they go into that 90-day that fast, that 90-day fast. So if both parties are in agreement, you will see that dopamine system go back and go back to normal, reset to its default, and you'll eventually people will find that they'll have that natural interest. Yeah. Got someone in the back there.
Hey, if I'm struggling with loneliness and I'm thinking it's because I have a low PEA, how do I boost my PEA without just trying to find a new relationship to boost it? How can I boost it outside of that so that I'm actually a happy individual single to become a happy couple?
There's no known way where it just literally occurs within that. Like I said, it's that chemistry that people experience when they first meet each other. There's no necessary because what PEA does, it fast tracks connections, neural connections between the various parts of the brain. So it's there for other functions in terms of accelerating connections. That's what it does. It fast tracks transfer of information. So when people are in that PEA, when they have PEA boost, then that's what it does. You actually just fast accelerating that flow of information about that person, so to speak, or lack of information, whatever way you look at it. And so that's essentially what's happening with PEA. There's no necessarily unlike serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, etc. There's no, as far as I'm aware, natural non-sexual ways, so to speak, of boosting PEA.
Is it, just on a follow-up question on that, when somebody loves a subject in school and they just excel because they just love studying it and they describe it it's just so much fun, is that potentially a situation where PEA is fast-tracking connections in that subject, which is making that person excel?
Good question. I would say the dopamine is playing a big role in that. Like I said, one of the key boosts of dopamine, I've mentioned 5 categories, is novelty. So if they enjoy just learning new things and they get a buzz from that, that's what that shows about that person is that they have a healthy dopamine system to begin with. They're not engaging in those negative sexual habits that we talked about, that desensitization, sensitization, and hyperfrontality. They're nowhere before that desensitization phase, and they're just in that healthy state of dopamine flow. And as a result, simple things like studying new things become very, very pleasurable to them, and it drives them to study more.
Sorry, just continuing to his question. Is there any study of a spiritual connection that would help to solve the problem, to have dopamine if you are spiritually connected?
Not a lot of, because unfortunately, like I said, there's a lot of bias in the literature when it comes to spiritual concepts. But just to make sure I'm answering your question right, you talk about is there any studies that show that spirituality builds connection. Just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, take the away the, I don't know the P, I don't know, but take away the need of connection to someone because
yeah.
you're fulfilled spiritually.
Good question. Good question. You know what? I don't know the answer to that question, but it'd be good to look into that, whether that's the case, because there's some people, they're just so satisfied with a relationship with God that they don't need that, and whether there's PEA with a religious experience, with having that worship experience, that'll be very fascinating if those same chemicals are released. But like I said, I don't think there's enough openness in the scientific literature to look into that, but that would be a good study to look into, for sure.
All right, I have 2 questions. One, you know how you said, like, too much sex isn't really good? So what is a healthy amount of sex?
Okay. Good question. Good question. I guess you're asking for a friend, I'm guessing.
I want to be married, so I just want to know,
Like, the jokes aside, that's a really good question. They say, like I said, I use that 96-hour timeline. So they say 96 hours, so every 4 days.
4 days.
Yeah, that's the optimum. I'm just going by what the study shows. That's all I'm doing. I'm just going by what the study shows. So, but if the studies, actually they recommend even to maintain that euphoria stage consistently.
That's my next question.
They recommend even longer, actually. Yeah. So, like I said, you want to balance that with oxytocin release as well, where it's that bonding. So you don't want it to go too long because you reduce pair bonding and you become to drift apart. But I'm just sharing the studies. That's all I can do. Yeah. 4 to 7 days is ideal. I'll put it that way. Yeah. Sorry? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I should stipulate that. Yeah. That's just what the study shows. Okay, don't shoot the messenger. Okay, don't shoot the messenger. Okay. Any other questions? Oh, sorry. Okay. All right, I've got one last question here.
I have been observing the people at the age of retirement. It seems that there are cases of men who experience depression, or some people start to have cognitive decline earlier than many people. I wonder, is that because when it comes to the age of retirement, women, as I talk to people, they tend to come to the point that they are satisfied with their life and they don't need sex. It's so much already. They learn something else. But men still get shocked from being retired or from their work, from their success. I don't know. And
Yeah, we'll talk a bit more about that in the lecture, how to avoid cognitive decline. You don't want to miss that, by the way, because that's applicable to everyone in terms of laying the foundation. Where there's studies that show that one of the things that builds the risk factors for dementia and Alzheimer's is dysregulated sexual behavior, which is very common in men. So it's not surprising. It's like pornography use, and they say that the combination of pornography use and like other forms of entertainment, like digital media, like we talked about digital media yesterday. You combine that with bad sexual behavior. That's both supernumerary stimuli. That's going to lead you to a downward trajectory, and that studies have shown that that's one of the major hits, one of the major risk factors for Alzheimer's and dementia. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. Oh yeah, we've got another one at the back.
There are quite a lot of young, a lot of young girls having babies, like having sex at very, very early in age in their lives, is there a psychological problem that goes with that?
The intuitive answer is yes, but I can't give a very concrete biochemical explanation for that. But yeah, I'm sure that will definitely have a deleterious effect. I don't know if anyone would like to. I don't know if Ravi, if you want to, answer that.
There's a simple concept of what you see changes how you see things. And so we live in a hypersexualized world where people are bombarded with this kind of information. And actually, to kind of be a little bit more direct, in Australia, the average age of first exposure to pornography is 8 years old. The average age of first sexual encounter is 12. And sex education in schools isn't until way later. What that means is children are being educated from the age of 8 to this practice, right, through pornography, and the porn industry is literally rechanging their brains so that they think that's how they should have relationships. A few months ago, I was speaking to a detective who actually works specifically in the Department of Child Abuse and all the rest, and they shared with me that they heard of a case study where a young, I want to say maybe 13-year-old girl, reported that her boyfriend told her, hey, when we have sex, I'm just going to punch you in the nose and you'll bleed and it'll be fun. And you're like, she's a 13-year-old girl. And she said, no. And he said, no, trust me, you'll enjoy it. And you ask yourself the question, where are they learning that kind of education? It's either coming from their parents or somewhere else, but they have to be seeing this. No 13-year-old boy wakes up one day and says, let me just punch someone in the face, and that's going to be fun when I'm intimate with them. And so I think that to answer your question, with the hypersexualization that we live in this world, more and more people are getting exposed to it at a very young age. And then because of that, they are now trying to experience what they've been educated on. I don't think it's a psychological problem. I don't think that it's a thing about pointing fingers to guys, girls, parents, or any of that. If anything, it's a question of, are you aware and are you educating your children early? With Australian statistics that say that first age of exposure is 8 years old, if you're waiting to have the sex ed talk with your kids after 9, it's kind of too late. I'm not a parent yet, and parents can make that own decision with their children. But being aware of these statistics, should impact how we go about educating our children, what we teach them, what they should learn. The world that we live in has changed, but the principles haven't. The principles of right and wrong are still the same. Children have very flexible minds. If you teach them right from a young age, they'll know right as they grow up. If you wait till they're 18 to teach them the right way, it's kind of too late.
Sure, we've got someone at the back there. We've got someone at the back.
Last question.
Yeah, I think we'll make it the...
What can a young man do to prevent getting problems later down the track, like erectile dysfunction, poor libido? I've just got some, young mates, they're like in their 20s, and they're already getting like erectile dysfunction. You look like young, healthy men, but like that's the last thing that I'm sure most men would want. Is there any research that shows what could do? I know perhaps exercising and sleep, but is there like anything else that you've come across?
Yeah, I remember treating a patient years ago for that, and one of the things that worked was nutrition. Having a whole foods, plant-based diet, reducing a lot of animal fat, because they say that there's a correlation between the build-up of atherosclerosis. They say that erectile dysfunction, all these things are related to cardiovascular disease. It's actually a good surrogate marker for cardiovascular disease. So reducing if you reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease, you're also going to reduce your risk for sexual dysfunction, so to speak, in particular erectile dysfunction. So, and also not watching porn is as simple as that. And also, just if they're in a relationship, like a marriage relationship, fasting for night, it works wonders. Because you've got the all the phytochemicals and all the different things that are at work. Exercise as well. Yeah, because you're getting that blood pumping. Yeah, so all of these things play a role. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, one more, and that's it. One more.
You talk about porn. Something faster than that. You just walk into the shopping center. The fashion. Before a man can turn his avert his eye from it, it's already into. This has become more ridiculous. At the front or at the back. And I think even the young girls in the churches can be very naive about it. They think it's fashionable, it's probably not hot, not warm. They didn't realize about the effect on, you probably can explain better. When the eye sees something, how fast it goes to the brain. And then, how can we do this? What shall we do with these? I even noticed the young girls, very young, the parents start to put that sort of clothes, exposing their body.
Thank you.
You think you can produce some kind of glasses that the men can wear? Well, I think the Lord Jesus said, if your eyes lead you to sin, take them out, right? So what should we do? Suggest the kind of glasses that can obscure that. Hey, that would be great.
Thank you for that observation and insight. All right, I won't keep you guys in too long, and I want you guys to come back for tomorrow. You're going to hear a wonderful topic on building healthy habits and how we can apply that in our lives. Thank you guys for coming.